Good morning, everyone. Nice to have so many visitors here today. We are continuing our discussion about H91, an act relating to emergency temporary shelter. And this morning, we're going to be hearing from Alex Farrell, who's the Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development, because as we have all heard and understood that how we help solve the homelessness problem is by having more housing and creating more housing. And so we're going to get an update about the things that the department is doing and their plans for the future. And welcome, Alex. Please join us. And this is your first time here this year, and we have a bunch of new committee members. We like to do introductions so that you know who's sitting around the table. We have one person who's dealing with two people who are dealing with medical issues this morning. I'm not sure where these two people are, but they'll be here shortly. So we'll start with introductions, and just if you're around the room and you haven't been through this before, we go all the way around the room. Teresa Wood from Waterbury, and I also serve Bolton, Buell's Gore, and Huntington.
I'm just remembering I had an 8:30 meeting with you.
Yes, you did. I'm gonna mention it.
Teresa, sorry, that's why I just like, I have Representative Van Dyke from Northfield, also served Berlin.
Forgetting.
Yeah.
Dan Noyes, representative from Woolkit, represent Belvedere, Hyde Park, and Johnson.
Ben Bishop from Colchester's Chittenden 20 district.
Good morning, Todd Nielsen. I represent Brandon Farmsdale.
Good morning. I'm Zon Eastis. I represent Guilford and Vernon, the bottom state.
Hi, I'm Jubilee McGill from Bridgeport. I also represent Middlebury, New Haven, and Wadebridge.
Hi, Alex Ray Garofano, Essex and Essex Junction.
Board Morse Committee Assistant Extraordinaire. Okay.
Cecil Brewster, Director of Communications for the Department. Kelly Shable, I'm Alex's wife, just here.
I hope you make him like really nervous or something.
I'm more nervous with her in the room.
Do your job.
I'm Taylor Abrams. I'm just a UVM intern for Representative Oslin.
Great.
I'm Beverly Bogat. I'm from the Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance.
Matthew DeGrove from Action Circles.
Mary Ellen Griffin, staff attorney at Vermont Legal Aid.
Andrea Smith, also from Vermont Legal Aid. Katie Fish, I'm just here to shout out Monica. And I'm Monica from the Department of Children. I'm Molly Dugan with Cathedral Square.
I'm Alex Grambles. I'm a policy advocate with the ACLU of Vermont.
Great. Oh, you're just walking. We're doing introductions, Brenda.
Yeah. Brenda Siegel, Executive Director of At Homelessness Vermont.
And Alex, the floor is yours. And committee members, we do have a number of documents from Alex. Thank you for sending them in advance. Feel free, please introduce yourself for the record, and we're happy to have you here this morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, everybody, for the introductions. My name is Alex Farrell. I'm the Commissioner at the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'll say right off the bat, don't feel like you need to look at all of those attachments, please. I want you to have them as a reference so that when you're thinking about the department or you hear certain programs or buzzwords, you know those are ours and you can get a quick reference for what the stats are. Also, please reach out to me anytime to learn more about those. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction about who DHCD is and where we fit into this ecosystem and what we're doing to create more units and specifically how we've adapted in the past few years to better address the need. So I have a lot of slides. So if I move quickly, that's why. We don't have to cover all of my slides today, but there's some important stuff I want to get through. So
what I will have people do, Alex, is to hold our questions till the end.
Great.
So you have a chance to get through them all. And so just write down your questions and then we'll do that.
Then I'll make a point to try to leave some time.
Yeah, that's okay. We have a lot of witnesses and we have a joint assembly at 10:30, so we'll try to smush everything together.
Thank you, Madam. Okay, so I'll briefly show you the ACCD organizational structure so you're aware of where we fit into the Agency of Commerce. Of the three departments, we are one, we're the largest, but as you'll see on the next slide, still not very big. This is our team. So if you hear about us, any of these divisions, the housing division, probably you all would interact with the most. We have a division for community planning and revitalization. They work with our communities to find ways to adjust zoning and land use to expand housing options. Division for historic preservation, I won't touch on today because that doesn't really touch your world much. But then the Vermont Community Development Program is a really key program that for decades has been administering US HUD funding to create housing and other projects. The housing division, I'll touch on really quickly. You can see we have 3 permanent employees in the housing division. That is 1 more than we used to have a couple years ago. And in this year's budget, the governor is asking to double the size to make us a 6-person housing division, which will be very exciting. So some really good stuff coming out of the housing division. We've really adapted that team. This next slide with the names of some of our leadership team, I just want you all to have for future reference. So feel free to reach out to any of these folks, and I've indicated what their role is. So anytime you need something from one of us, please feel free to reach out. I also like to, because you're all getting to know me, I like to share some of my personal background, why I do this work. And I look to my family and housing instability, where that's affected them, through my 2 brothers, one who has intellectual disabilities. We need to think years ahead. What are we going to do as he's in adulthood now? He's 21. What's housing going to look like for him? And this is something Chair Wood and I have talked about in the past, making sure that we have housing options for folks with intellectual disabilities, and that's a challenge. Another one of my brothers, I lost a substance use disorder, and throughout the course of that, housing instability played a really big role. So I know how impactful this can be. Okay, I'm going to launch into our program. So please, just if something is unclear or I use an acronym you don't know, feel free to stop me. Okay, so historically, we have operated in this housing ecosystem. So I'm going to pull up a diagram right here that shows where we fit in, and I'm going to admit to stealing this from Seth Leonard right off the bat.
Well, you don't have to admit it because he wrote it right up there.
I know. You know what? I put that on there because if it's wrong, I want someone to call Seth. No, I'm just kidding. No, I actually just find this really useful because it's a complex network that we operate in. And so you see Chris Donnelly and me talking a lot. It's because us, the homeownership centers, AHS, we're all coordinating constantly, sometimes to the extent that I think folks don't realize what's our program, what's VSHA's program, VHFA's program. It's because we know it's a complicated network, and so we work together a lot. We try to make it so that you can plug into any of us, and we're going to help you and make sure that you're sent to the right person, but it can be complicated. And so what I like to flag on this diagram is this gives us a good sense of historically what DHCD did in this ecosystem and where we fell. And so you can see federal block grants. This is the Vermont Community Development Program, Community Development Block Grants. This is traditionally the funding source that we had at our disposal. DHCD historically, prior to the pandemic, didn't receive general funds from the state legislature, and so the pandemic created opportunities for us to get creative. And but this is historically what the ecosystem has been, and I'm going to talk very soon about how we've adapted so that we could contribute more. So and a lot of these other players you hear from, so you know VHCB, you know VSHA and VHFA. So I won't dive into what they do. Okay. I do want to talk briefly about our Vermont Community Development Program and 3 different ways that we've been funding units here in the state. So CDBG is the first. So this is a program that was developed in the 70s. What I'll say about this is our allocation from HUD is about $7 million. It has been about that for decades. So really since the early 2000s, we've been getting between 6 and 7 million. So you can imagine that the impact of that, especially after the pandemic, has really diminished. And so this is contributing to us trying to get creative and find new ways to have more of an impact. If we can't just count on those federal dollars, what can we do? We also administered some coronavirus relief funds, as you can see, but then on the far right, the recovery housing, this is sadly funding that we get and increases based on opioid deaths and usage in the state. And so when we get an increase, it's bad news, but we get to have a greater impact. Again, these stats are for your reference so that you can take a look at the impact, but please feel free to reach out. I've also included a full annual report for you all to see in more depth what we do with that program. This is also the program that's going to receive, if folks saw some headlines, Vermont's going to get $68 million in disaster relief money. As a result of the floods, this is going to have to be a coordinated effort with multiple units of government, but that will be flowing through us. Again, this next slide, I just want you to have for your reference. We don't need to cover it, but it gives you a good sense of who the funders are funding sort of the traditional types of affordable housing. It gives some data on how many in 2024, how many units were funded, how many of those units were set aside for homelessness. I want to flag this does not include VHIP. So you can see on the bottom there, you can see DHCD funded. This is through the Vermont Community Development Program. So this does clearly tell the tale that while we're not a significant funder, of the funding there, we're only about 5 million. We do play an important policy role and we act as a coordinator between the different entities. So we don't have a lot of funding to offer, but we do work with all these teams. What I'll say as we get in here and talk about VHIP, that 439 units that you see that were funded in 2024 dedicated to homelessness. One of the reasons we really like to focus on VHIP is between 2021 and 2024, VHIP added between 600 and 700 units for homelessness during that period. So VHIP has really changed the game in a lot of ways. It's a source that we just historically didn't have. And it's really been quite an asset. I should say that 600 to 700 units funded for homelessness during that period. So this next slide you may be familiar with, anyone who's looked at the housing needs assessment. This is a joint effort between us and VHFA that I'm sure has been previewed to you all, but it covers our needs, but breaks down the data in a lot of different ways, looking at the whole housing spectrum with sort of that first building block being what do we need to do to address homelessness? And then look at the whole ecosystem from there. Other factors we take into account, how do we keep folks housed that are precariously housed? So we look upstream. DHCD's role is largely to look upstream and prevent folks from falling into homelessness, produce a market where people can stay stably housed. And DHCD's role is also to look at a minimum 5, 10 years, decades into the future. And so the housing needs assessment is one display of that, but we also provided an annex to that to set housing targets that go out to 2050, because that's really what we have to do. And we see our role as we are in an unhealthy housing market now. What do we need to do right now to prevent this state of affairs from coming about again? That's really our responsibility. So this next slide is not going to be shocking to you, but this is just part of what we think about and what we're trying to solve for every day. You'll notice the timeline here of where our rental vacancy rate decreased down below healthy levels. 5% is what is considered a healthy level. And you'll see that this timeline coincides with massive increases in homelessness in Vermont. And so something that we're actively trying to combat. And so when my colleagues over at AHS are struggling to place folks in units because there aren't the units, this is why. This is a major contributor to that. Obviously, units aren't the only side of it, but we all know this is really the biggest piece that's constraining us right now. This is another piece, and again, what keeps us up at night is that we have tens of thousands of Vermonters that are precariously housed right now. The red in these bars are folks who are paying 50% or more, or 30 to 50% of their income, more than 50% of their income on their housing. The orange is where they're paying between 30 and 50% of their income. So these are folks that are in the orange considered housing cost burdened, and then the red is severely cost burdened. The red is what really concerns us because these are people that are precariously housed. A lot of different factors could come into play to move these households into homelessness. So we're thinking about ways constantly, how do we keep these folks housed? This next slide, we don't need to talk about. I just like to reference some good literature. There have been a ton of great studies. We don't need to dive into all of them, but just looking at all these different root causes statistically of where homelessness has become more prevalent, where it's ebbed and flowed, and what the causes are there. So a lot of this has guided our work in the past several years. But that's, again, just really for your reference. Okay, so I'm going to do a very quick recap because I think many of the folks in this room have been here for the past couple of years. So I'm not going to dive into it, but what have we done over the past several years as a state on housing? We've been able, thankfully, as a result of an influx of federal dollars to invest, according to Department of Finance and Management, between FY 21 and 25, we were able to invest around $600 million in the production of units. So that excludes things like the ERAP program, which was rental assistance. That excludes things like HAF, which was mortgage assistance. So this is dollars that went towards unit creation or preservation. We were able to use pandemic dollars to double down on and reinvigorate or focus on tools that reinvigorate and make sure we make better uses of our structures so that we're not just focusing on new builds. We're actually rehousing folks in structures that we have now and often repurposing those, even if it means cleaning them up with brownfields dollars. And then I'm going to talk over the next 2 slides very quickly about some of the reforms to our zoning and bylaws and our land use. So the Home Act, if folks recall, this was sort of the first landmark land use bill that was passed. And as a reminder, this focused more on municipal planning and bylaws. And there were specific carve-outs to ensure certain density standards, and there were carve-outs, specific protections for things like conversions from hotels into shelter for affordable housing or homelessness. There were also carve-outs for shelters in the Home Act. This next slide talks about Act 181, which was sort of a part 2. This was last year's bill. This Act 181 was several bills all coming together. So there were pieces from the governor's tripartisan bill. There were pieces from 2 different bills in the House. This was a lot of different bills that all came together. And really pieces from every bill ended up in there. So pieces that I can speak to. This is what now set out this new framework for Act 250, new tiered jurisdiction framework. But what's important to this committee and to us in there, and which was included in a couple of different bills, including the governor's tripartisan bill, was some specific carve-outs to match what was in the Home Act, but again, protections for converting hotels into permanent housing and protections for shelters. Now looking at Act 250, how can we create those carve-outs in Act 250 to ensure that those projects, again, have one more hurdle removed so that they can move forward faster without risk of appeal. And that really is the big risk of those projects. Appeal is what have held them up and have really disrupted our efforts. Okay, so I'm going to talk. I'm now launching into DHCD and what we've done to adapt DHCD to better fit into the ecosystem and meet the needs of what's been happening over the past several years. So historically, as a funder, as I said before, we received this federal funding. That's a pot that has stayed somewhat flat. And so our role as a funder has somewhat diminished using those CDBG dollars. But that was historically how we came in and complemented those dollars from VHFA and VHCB. We also have been able to use tax credits at times to create housing units. But again, that's not a massive tool. So we've had to think long and hard about what we can do differently. And then you can see the other areas where we weighed in on housing policy. So the department, in a lot of ways, was more sort of guiding things and was a policy advocate in a lot of ways, and would get involved in land use and zoning to some extent. But this next slide is a timeline that shows over the past several years how the department has adapted, and specifically how we now have gotten involved in directly funding units and tried to skew those efforts to meet the needs of lowest income Vermonters. And so using our CDBG dollars back in 2019, getting creative, we doubled down on an effort that had actually been underway for decades, but we wanted to make sure that there was a commitment to it. So very briefly, I'll just describe what we call our scattered sites program through CDBG. Think about the upstream that I was talking about before, making sure precariously housed folks can stay in their homes. And so these are revolving loan funds that we administer to the home ownership centers, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And the folks that can access these often need very low cost home repairs, say a roof issue, perhaps a furnace issue, a bathroom that's just not a healthy environment. But they can't necessarily access traditional mechanisms of financing these repairs. And so they can access these revolving loan funds. So in 2019, we stepped up our commitment to make sure that a quarter of the CDBG allocation every year would be set aside for this purpose, so that these low income homeowners could get these low interest loans that can be forgiven and under certain circumstances to keep people in their homes, because that's just really, really important, thinking about that upstream. In 2020, the precursor to VHIP was established using coronavirus relief funds. This didn't look a lot like the VHIP that we know today. This was just think rental rehab, and there was no requirement. I think there was only a HUD fair market rent requirement, no other requirements as to who we housed. Then in the green, I don't know if you can tell, but there's green font here. You really can't. That's fine. I've laid out a couple of the land use things. We really started leaning into land use. How do we adapt our systems and encourage our municipalities to enable more housing, specifically more affordable housing? So we set the stage in August 2020 with a guide, Zoning for Great Neighborhoods, trying to encourage municipalities, giving them the tools to do it, to improve their zoning. In 2021, this is where we got our first iteration of VHIP using ARPA dollars. And in this version, under the actual VHIP program, we established a requirement to house folks exiting homelessness. And so this is where we started now adding a new way of bringing units online to rehouse folks out of homelessness. So we're no longer looking at just our traditional mechanisms using my team's funding with CDBG, the VHCB dollars and VHFA dollars. You're now complementing all that with this rapid response program that, while isn't a sort of you aren't going to see big multifamily units, you're not going to see massive projects, that the impressive stuff that CHT and these others do. These are small, but really impactful because they're geographically spread out. Our most effective county for placing VHIP units is Rutland County. So this has just been a really nimble program that has been serving a purpose specific to the time that we're in. 2022, we established the Manufactured Home Improvement and Repair Program. Like with VHIP, I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit. But this is, again, going back to that upstream, let's keep people in their homes, focused on folks in our manufactured home communities that we've neglected for decades, where there's a lot of really precariously housed folks in these communities. And so one of the components of that is home repairs to make sure these folks can stay in safe and healthy housing, as well as some other investments to improve the health of the park. But we'll get into that in a little bit. 2023 is when the Home Act was passed. Along with that was when the state made a commitment to now invest state dollars in VHIP. And while that was still one-time funding to us and to our partners, that signaled a commitment to keeping VHIP around. And so when you hear us talk about VHIP 2.0, that's us signaling we now have state dollars invested in VHIP. And that was a really big deal to us. 2024, we launched our Homes for All initiative. I won't touch too much on this. The broad strokes is this is giving more Vermonters the tools to become small scale developers. We say small scale, we're talking 1 to 4 units, think an ADU up to a small 4 unit, what we call infill development, and trying to expand the number of people that are doing this. Ideally, these are paired with VHIP grants. If folks can take these on, do this themselves, they receive the VHIP grant. So we're trying to get more people involved, more people contributing these units. 2024, when Act 181 passed, these are when the interim exemptions to Act 181 went into place and created, again, removed another regulatory barrier for this unit production. And then we won't touch on 2025 because that's a much bigger conversation about the different proposals that are out there. So we'll save that for another day. Okay, so I'm going to touch on VHIP quickly. You all have this VHIP 1-pager, actually it's a 2-pager in your packets there. But this is just VHIP at a high level. You can see the different iterations as we move from coronavirus relief funds to ARPA funds, and then finally getting some state funds. This year, we are proposing to actually make VHIP permanent with base funding and 2 employees to run the VHIP program, which is really exciting for us. We did cross the 1,000 unit threshold with VHIP, which our staff really celebrated. You can see it's been cost effective. So what we don't get from a program like VHIP, VHCB and others, because they do far more complex projects, they're able to get perpetual affordability. They're able to get units that will stay in this affordable housing portfolio permanently. We're giving these property owners only $39,000 on average per unit. And so the bargain that we all agreed to make was we're going to get either 5 or 10 years of this covenant on this property where you need to meet these requirements. And then it's yours to rent however and to whomever you would like. So we're still getting units, but at least in this short period, because we're only giving them a small amount, we are getting that commitment to rehousing somebody out of homelessness or serving folks that are very low income. But this has been a very cost-effective, impactful program. Oh, and I love the map because you can see who's being served the most. I love seeing Rutland in the lead in something like this because we know how much need there is in Rutland and how many underutilized structures there are. If you go through downtown Rutland or in Rutland Town or West Rutland, you see so many neighborhoods that are just underutilized because we have structures that just need to come back online. And you think, boy, people should be living in these. VHIP's doing that, and it's been incredible.
And the Northeast Kingdom.
And the Northeast Kingdom, exactly. St. Johnsbury. So I want to give St. Johnsbury a little credit here. They've done something that we thought was really great. They actually they have a registry fee that covers a couple different housing types, and they use that fee to go into their housing trust. And they created basically a VHIP complementary grant, smaller scale, so grants of $1,000 to $3,000 to do things like a handrail improvement, things like that, but it can complement VHIP. So they're doubling down on VHIP up in St. Johnsbury, and that's been really great to see. So the manufactured home improvement and repair program, again, you have a more in-depth one pager in your packets there, so you can look at the MER program in more depth if you want. Another program that we're really proud of that the team developed. So again, this is focused on mobile home parks because these are folks who own the unit and don't own their land. So that creates a really precarious situation for these homeowners because folks don't want to finance something that you don't own the land on. That also makes it really tricky if you end up in a situation where your home needs repairs. In the case of folks in a mobile home park, your only equity is in your unit. And in many cases, especially older manufactured homes, this isn't necessarily always the case. Older manufactured homes actually depreciate over time, whereas our homes that are site built generally tend to appreciate over time. And so this puts folks in a really bad position. So we're trying to help keep these folks in their home and keep some value in their home. And so since they can't borrow against the value of their land, they can access the manufactured home improvement and repair program to make home repairs. These are grants to the homeowners. The parks themselves also need investment. And so the parks can seek funding to improve the infrastructure. So whether this is improvements to the road system, conduits to the units, maybe water and wastewater systems. We've improved septic systems with this, which has been tremendous. This pairs nicely with the Agency of Natural Resources Healthy Homes program. If folks are familiar with that, that's upgrades to water systems, clean water for manufactured home parks and low-income Vermonters. So this is paired really, really well with that. And this also makes investments to expand parks. The goal of this being to make these more economically feasible.
Yeah. Commissioner, I am going to say, I'm looking ahead a little bit and then thinking about our schedule, and I'm going to ask that we kind of move through the incentive study stuff so that we can have time for a few questions, if that's okay.
I think that's perfect. I think I can just touch on the study and end it there. And since you have the PowerPoint at your disposal, I'm not going to get into these in great detail. What I just want to flag is this was a joint effort between us, VHFA, VHCB, LAOB. And the goal is, under this new tiered jurisdiction, how can we make sure we continue to incentivize priority housing projects, which is one of the main ways from a regulatory perspective that we can incentivize affordable housing. You can see through here a number of different ways we want to incentivize that. And number of those are in a couple of the bills floating around the building, including the bill that the governor recently introduced. So why don't I pause there? You can also just see one slide that flags some of the other data and report efforts that are underway or have recently completed. But I can stop there, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate all the information. We have several questions. Being chair, I get to start off. Okay. So you talked about, I guess in total between sort of your regular CDBG funds that are going out there, that 439 units that were for people who were exiting homeless, and then another 600 to 700 through the VHIP 1 and 2, I'm presuming. Now, the VHIP 1, the 5 years is coming to a close. And so my question is, what kind of data are you keeping on the transition that happened? So you talked a lot today about those folks who are precariously housed. I might say that people who are in housing that, where that 5 years is coming up, might be added to that list if the landlords are now, going to exit them and raise the rents on those. So I'm interested in what kind of data that your department is keeping about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this in two ways. The first is that if you look at the back of your VHIP page, or you're on your computer, the second page, this just gives you a timeline. So you can see some of the first units, so 66 of those first units using coronavirus relief funds in 2025 their covenant will expire. Just a reminder that none of those units rehouse folks exiting homelessness because that was coronavirus relief funds. So it's really towards the end of 2026 and more so starting in 2027. 27 through 29 is when we're really focused on those households that's the bulk of the folks that have exited homelessness into VHIP units. So we're approaching this in a couple of different ways. So we are instituting an annual recertification process to maintain records of how folks are complying, but also what the experience has been, what the turnover has been like, because we talk to CHT a lot and we understand even in those units where they have a lot of systems and a lot of supports, oftentimes they do see some turnover. So we want to understand, how do these landlords who don't have all those systems and supports necessarily, even though we do plug them in, how's the experience there? So we want to understand how that's going and then what their plans are after the 5 or 10 year covenant expires. That effort's underway. We'll know more probably after this summer, after this July.
Okay. I mean, I think it's really important. I happen to be a supporter of VHIP, and I think we need to balance that with, what you talked about in terms of stuff through VHCB and the permanently affordable. Obviously, there's long lead times on those big projects, and the VHIP, it can happen much more quickly, but there's trade-offs with that. And so it is going to be important for us on a policy level to understand what are those trade-offs. And if that means that somebody is housed for 5 years, well, that might be okay, but it might not be okay. And we want to know how many people end up needing to seek other housing in those situations. So we'll look forward to more data about that as that progresses. And then I'm understanding that there's a process to get a waiver of that requirement. And can you tell us how many waivers that you have issued and under what circumstances?
It's less than 20, is my last recollection. I don't have the data in front of me. It's a very small number.
Okay.
And we are very, how do I want to put this? We are not lenient at all. We do not want to issue a waiver. And I have rejected many requests for waivers. And I can give you an example. We've had landlords who coordinated entry proposes, a list of potential tenants, and they do have a right. The statute was written so that certain things, certain concerns that a property owner has can be grounds for them to decline a tenant. So if that number reaches, say, 10, 12 folks, and they ask for a waiver, well, then we're going to scrutinize why they're declining these tenants. And if they aren't on justifiable grounds, then we're going to say, no, you still have to comply with this. And their compliance period doesn't start until someone's house. So you can't run out the clock, so to speak.
Mhm.
We don't want people, for lack of a better term, gaming the system. So the circumstances under which we have granted waivers is where it's more a geographic issue where the unit is not, they can't find a good pairing, and the coordinated entry leads for agree. Basically, we look to them to say, what do you recommend in this case? So if the CE organization were to say, no, we should be able to place someone here, I'm not going to grant a waiver.
Mhm.
So that's really a key for us.
Okay, well, it's good to see that you're really working with the coordinated entry organizations to do
Well,
that.
And I want to give them credit. And, Angus Cheney is one who has just done a phenomenal job of reaching out to us, letting us know where he sees opportunities. And we really value that feedback and that loop.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I've lost the final thing. So I saw Dan's hand first, so we'll go Dan and then around the table, seeing Dan's next question.
Thank you so much. I think that building age-specific housing is probably one of the biggest impacts we can have on helping solve a lot of our housing crisis, because older Vermonters really have no place to go, especially in rural parts of our state, because they're overhoused and we don't have the infrastructure to be able to build affordable housing in our village centers. And just really want to make the pitch that I would like to see more thought process going into how we help communities build age-specific housing, so that we open up housing stock up in rural areas so that people can catch them before, they're falling down. Because I see many of them in the communities I represent, people get to a point where they can't maintain the house, but they also have no place to go. And that's where their families are. It's where their community connections are. So I think investments in age-specific housing are really, really important. And along your VHIP, is there a way to help, is there a way to enhance home share in that, so that people who are looking to engage in a home share relationship with having someone come in their home could draw down money or borrow money through that revolving loan, so that they could, make sure their home is ready for someone to come in and to live with them, so that they can stay in their home. And I just was thinking about that when you were talking. So I was throwing it out there and dropped an email to Connor to say, you should connect and talk about this. Maybe there's something that could happen there. And just my last thing, real quick, is the mobile home MMHIR, sorry. What is that again? Mobile home
Improvement.
Can they use that for stormwater mitigation? Because a lot of the parks in my community have been trying to comply with the 3-acre stormwater rule.
Yeah.
Can it be used for that?
It can go towards that. There's a broader conversation that needs to happen with the 3-acre rule, because this is really
No doubt.
disproportionately affecting a lot of communities, including some, by the way, that are 55 and over communities.
Yeah.
So this we're really focused on.
We're losing housing spots because we have to comply with the stormwater runoff, and therefore can't put in more housing.
Yeah, to me, the 3-acre rule has been a classic example of where the regulatory system has a direct negative consequence on our housing stock, and was not intended, and I don't think it was thought of. But this is why folks need to coordinate.
Fix it.
Yeah. Thank you very much
I
for
think
mentioning
you might be coming on the 3-acre rule. I'm serious.
I've heard those rumors.
Yes, yeah, I'm just gonna go right around to see if you have any questions, Doug.
Sure. I'm just trying to get the best picture I can as to the amount of money that's available through DHCD.
Yeah.
You were talking about the community development program, sort of 3 pots totaled roughly $17 million if I did my quick math. But then there was reference on slide 2 over the last 5 years, $600 million coming in of federal dollars, obviously due to ARPA and other things. Did that 600 million just represent what flowed through GHCD, or was that some of the other alphabet soup of
Yeah.
players?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So the CDBG program, your math is right. I'll just carve out an exception. CDBG CV was pandemic related, so that goes away. So really, 7 million for CDBG and then, 1 or 2 for recovery housing. So, sort of under 10 million or in the 10 million range is roughly what we expect through that program. And then that $600 million represents what we as a state invested in unit production. So that most of that went to VHCB. A good chunk of it went to VHFA. Some of it came to us for VHIP and MER. Yeah.
All right. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Todd, do you have any questions? No? Don? Okay, Jubilee?
Yeah, a couple, Teresa asked most of mine.
No.
I'm just wondering, since with the VHIP 2.0, how many are choosing the 5-year grant versus the 10-year forgivable loan?
It's been about a third so far. The data,
A third?
a third opting for the 5-year. I'm sorry, the 5-year.
Okay.
The data has been, I'll say, we want more data on it, but because the funding has essentially dried up, we haven't been able to see the longer term results. So we're eager to see how that pans out. Depending on the homeownership center, we're seeing different levels of uptake of the 5-year versus the 10-year. And we are actually seeing a lot of property owners who had participated in VHIP 1.0 under the 5-year are actually inclined to continue doing that because they saw the success in 1.0. So we're trying to understand how we can add more incentives to focus there.
And then it sounds like this would be a teeny tiny portion given the number who are asking for the waiver. But I know if someone asks for the waiver in the 5-year, then they do the 80% AMI income requirement. And I'm just wondering how that is, like whose responsibility it is for calculating that and documenting and capturing that.
So the requirement is to meet HUD fair market rents for your area. And so when the grant agreement between the property owner is signed with the homeownership center.
I think for the 5-year grant, it's if they do get the waiver.
Oh, is it just 80?
It's no, well, they have to be under that 80% area median income.
Oh, the tenant. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Yes. So in that case, I believe I should check. Chris Donnelly was just here. I should check with the HOCs. I believe the HOCs help with compliance. I can get back to you and confirm that.
Okay. And then just a comment. Last year we had put one of the priority populations in there is for service agencies doing for youth runaway and homeless youth programs. I'd love to connect with you out of that. My work outside is the assistant director of the Vermont Coalition of Runaway and Homeless Youth, and we literally have federal funding to be able to house youth and transition age youth in these kind of transitional living programs, but we just need apartments. So I would love to connect with you and get those up and running.
I appreciate that. We've been trying to find other partners to collaborate with VHIP and of course, prioritizing homelessness and working with the coordinated entry organizations is priority number 1, but also we have found ways to get creative and utilize it for housing for folks with intellectual disabilities and other vulnerable populations. And so this seems like a really good opportunity to further pair.
Yeah, that's what we specifically put it in the language as one of the priority groups. So I'd love to connect with you.
Thank you.
Your final?
Mine's quick, and you just brought it up. More intentional effort around housing for folks with intellectual disabilities. I think to Representative Noise's, I think your department plays a big implementation of personal intentional. As you mentioned in your intro, it is a huge need, and the more heads that think about that, and in the future, the better off our communities will be.
I appreciate that. And I'm sorry that I didn't include those efforts in the slide deck. We have been really successful. I think our funding to Heartbeat is going to go to really good use up in Hardwick. We were able to get creative to help fund Riverflow and Moncton. That's something that we were really vested in. And of course, we're focused on the St. Paul Street project with CHT. And so I've been talking to Marla McQuiston and others about what are other ways to think about this ecosystem, because frankly, we're putting them in a position to compete for housing dollars in a really competitive market. And so what can we do to alleviate that?
I appreciate
Thank
it.
you very much for bringing that up.
I remembered what I wanted to ask, which was, I remember last year when we, talked about the 10-year program. At the time, the department did not want to include homelessness as a priority population. We added it. I just am under the impression that in the sort of permanent version of VHIP that you removed that as a priority population. Is that accurate?
The priority is still always there. It's not a requirement of the 10-year.
Okay. So how does that actually work?
So the original program design is administered as designed. And so the 5-year, you have to rehouse somebody exiting homelessness, or you'd have to seek a waiver. With the 10-year, the requirement is that you meet HUD fair market rents, and then there's a priority list, the priority populations in there. That is sort of where the preference is. I'd have to talk to the homeownership centers to better understand how it's administered on the ground.
Yeah. Honestly, if we're going to have the kind of impact that we need to have on reducing homelessness, it needs to be more than just a priority. It needs to be a requirement.
I'd say the program won't work if the 10 years, if you have the same requirements for 5 or 10 year, people will never choose the 10-year option. And maybe that's fine, but I couldn't see myself choosing to double my compliance period if it's the same.
So I guess what we would appreciate seeing from you, I know the 10-year program is relatively new, but I would appreciate seeing from you the data on the 10-year program and the number of people exiting homelessness into the 10-year program.
We can look into that. I can reach out to the homeownership centers and see if they have good data on that.
Well, if it's priority, it seems like the department should be keeping data on whether those priority populations are being served.
I'm sure I'd have to talk to the program administrators to better understand how that data is captured.
Okay, so we'd appreciate some follow-up on that. That would be great.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I realized when I went to the right, I went right to Dan. Do you have any questions?
I didn't.
Okay.
Don't worry, I would have.
Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you being here, and you did very well in front of your wife.
She throws me off a little bit.
It was great. It's great to have you here. Thank you very much. Witnesses, I'm sorry that we're running a little bit late, but it's hard to get the commissioner here, and so we took a little extra time for questions. So Mary Ellen, please join us. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Mary Ellen Griffin. I'm a staff attorney at Vermont Legal Aid in St. Johnsbury. At Legal Aid, we are really appreciative of the work of this committee and of this very important bill. I've been watching the testimony that you've been taking, which has been a lot. Appreciate the thoroughness, and I'm impressed with the engagement and a little bit intimidated. So I did want to say, you are very knowledgeable. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I definitely welcome your questions. So what I want to start out with is talking about our recent legal needs assessment, which found that Vermont is in the midst of an eviction crisis, which is really relevant to H91. Eviction is one of the primary leading causes and what people end up becoming homeless. And so I think slowing down the rate of evictions, fewer people entering homelessness is really key to ending homelessness in Vermont. Our legal needs assessment, I do want to give you this one quote. Our legal needs assessment found that eviction filings are up significantly and that the number of people seeking advice from us about evictions is up 45%. The the coming cuts to federal subsidies is probably going to worsen this problem. So it's just something for this committee to keep in mind by way of background. And then we support the bill, H91. There are a few things that we would ask to be added. First, we really appreciate that the bill removes the room cap. The room cap led to the prioritization policy, which has been really problematic. But we would ask that the bill include a method to determine availability of rooms. We often hear from the department that rooms are not available either because there's just no rooms in the state available or because of lack of funding. But it's very hard to understand how they came up with those numbers or where they're getting this. And it's not really transparent. So we would ask that there be a transparent method of saying, this is what's available, this is how we figured that out. We would also ask that the eligibility stay at least where it was in the big bill last year. Certainly our goal, and it sounds like the goal of this committee, is for that everyone who is unhoused to be sheltered. But that is not the system we have. We already have very restricted eligibility for emergency shelter, so we're asking to please not restrict it further. The first one is that the disability variance form. The disability variance form is already really challenging for people who are homeless and not connected to regular medical care. I frequently meet with people who are homeless and report this as one of the reasons why they can't get into emergency housing. And I talk with medical professionals who are wary of signing a form for someone that they just met and that they don't know all the history for. Requiring a medical provider to attest to a person's disability is expected to be a long, continuing, and indefinite duration will exclude many people who are eligible. Moreover, substantially impedes the individual's ability to live independently is way too high a standard. That's more appropriate for long-term care than for emergency housing. So we would ask that you maintain the eligibility for the disability variance to be that somebody with a disability that poses a safety or welfare risk of temporary emergency housing is not authorized.
You said we can interrupt.
Yeah, please.
So I'm just going to play devil's advocate a little bit. How would that be verified?
The same way it is right now. That is what the standard is right now. So the same form.
So with a medical professional or not with a medical professional?
Right now, the requirement is a medical professional.
Right. I'm familiar with right now, but I guess I'm trying to figure out, you're saying to lessen the requirement for what the medical professional is signing off on. Is that what I'm interpreting?
I would love to see it lessened. I don't have it, but my ask is that it just not be heightened. Leave it the way it is.
Don't make it even more restrictive.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's problems enough with the way it is. I don't have a proposal for how to make it easier, but I just don't want to make it harder.
Gotcha.
I'd also ask that we keep the same standards for people who are pregnant or people who have suffered the death of a spouse or lived through a natural or child or lived through a natural disaster. Right now, that's what eligibility is, but under H91 proposes restricting these categories to only 30 days into the third trimester. Those three categories are the three smallest categories of eligibility for emergency housing. So restricting those further is really not going to save a lot of money. Limiting emergency housing to only the third trimester of pregnancy does not adequately protect the health of women and babies. The academic research shows that health and self-care during the early stages of pregnancy have a huge impact on the health of the child, preventing problems that have a significant cost to society down the line. Moreover, in our cases at Legal Aid, we found that it takes people much more than 30 days to get back on your feet after suffering the death of a child or living through a natural disaster. We also find that people in these situations tend to turn to their informal networks first, and that's what we want. So, your house burns down or you're flooded out, you go stay with your sister if you can. And often that's enough for people to get back on their feet, but it's not always. And so we don't want to say you have to use emergency housing first or you're not going to get it. So we'd ask that, that the standards stay the same as it was in the big bill last year. So pregnant, all trimesters, those who have lost housing due to the death of a family member, and victims of natural disasters. Talking also about what we hear from our clients, we're hearing a lot of barriers to access for people with disabilities that are really concerning to us. The first one is that you can no longer apply in person for emergency assistance. You have to call on the phone. So we impose this burden on people who have limited access to phones, limited access to ability to charge their phone, and you have to call day after day often. So if you call and they're like, yes, you're eligible, but there's no rooms today, you have to call tomorrow. And so you call, you sit on hold day after day. I'm not sure how to solve the problem of like, why do you need to call every day? And we do have people that say, I called one day, they went through all my stuff and argued with me about whether I was eligible and decided in the end I was eligible, but there was no rooms. So then I called the next day and they said, you're not eligible. I have the same argument. So like, can we just say, okay, you're eligible, but we don't have a room, call tomorrow, and it's somehow marked there, and that you could apply in person. I asked, to keep the disability variance form at least not more complicated than it already is, so that a provider can evaluate somebody on the first visit. We've also seen a number of people excluded from hotels because of having service animals, which is not legal, but it's happening a lot. And people can't find a room because they have a service animal. We've also talked to increasing number of people who are excluded because of do not rent lists, which is becoming a really big problem for our clients. So a do not rent list is a list that the hotel maintains. They're a private operator. They can decide who they're going to rent to and not rent to. And they decided they said, Mary Ellen Griffin, she's on our do not rent list. We are not taking her as a client. And it's hard to know why people get placed on the do not rent list or exactly who's on them. They're not public. You can't appeal them. You can't know why someone got on it. But when I ask people, like, so what happened? It's typically disability-related conduct. So I had a service animal. I had a mental health breakdown and ended up having to be taken away in an ambulance and hospitalized. I yelled at the front desk clerk, these kinds of things. So the problem is that there's no place for people to go then once you're on a do not rent list. And these are some of the most vulnerable people in need of emergency housing. So we would ask that the bill include a requirement for the department to develop emergency housing options for people who are eligible for emergency housing, but are excluded from hotels. Finally, award letters. We would ask that the department be required to issue people award letters. Right now, if you call, you get told on the phone what your award is. So, you're approved for 4 days, you're approved for 28 days. You can go to this hotel. It's really hard to keep track of that, and especially people with cognitive impairments, people who are dealing with all kinds of things, to track on what have they been approved for, when does their authorization expire? And selfishly, as an advocate, it's really hard to understand. So someone comes to my office and they say, this is what happened. It doesn't totally make sense. It would be really helpful to have a piece of paper. You're approved for this reason, for this amount of time. I can then have a conversation and talk to them about, okay, this is where you're at. These are your next steps.
So again, I can hear DCF in my head saying, often people don't have addresses. Where do we send it to? I'm just trying to think, because I agree with you about this, because it's when we think of it as a benefit, every other benefit in the Agency of Human Services requires written notification of termination of what your benefit is and your appeal rights. That has not been the case in this quote unquote program. When you said a piece of paper, most people have an email. So I'm thinking that might be a potential option, electronic notification. But we've run into this over and over again, and I appreciate your sentiment about it, because it can be confusing. Somebody might come to you, 3 weeks later after understanding or not understanding what's just happened to them, and not being able to, present some sort of official notification from the department or the entity is important, I think. So thank you for bringing that up.
I think you're absolutely right that an electronic notification would be better than a paper for most people. Mm-hmm. And I think the department could just say, do you want me to text it to you? Want me to email it to you? I also would love it if they could email it to the community provider the person's working with, if they're working with someone. So I see Brenda Siegel in the room. She works with a lot of people. If they're working with Brenda, do you want me to just email it to Brenda? Or if it's legal aid, we work with fewer people or whoever, then the community provider can also have it when the person shows up at the office. okay, let me help you understand, Ken, like, this is where we're at.
Mhm.
That would be, if the person gives permission over the phone for it to be shared with their community support person, that would certainly help. The pushback we've received from the department on the award letters was just, oh, it's a pain to create the form, but it turns out they have this form that they give to the hotel. So that's the slide. It's a little messy, but they already fill out a very, very similar form and send it to the hotels. So we're just asking that it also go to the person and maybe to their support people. Not exactly this one. This is for the hotels, but to the people. Then I did want to talk a little bit about reasonable accommodation. The requirement, we've definitely seen a lot of problems with reasonable accommodation in this program. So just to back up by way of background, the requirement to reasonably accommodate comes from both federal and state laws that require government actors to ensure that people with disabilities have equal access to government programs. So the Department of Justice and HUD have a joint memo that they sort of explain it. And I like the way that they phrase it here, which there's a lot of cases you could read, but so just to quote them, it's a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service that may be necessary for a person with a disability to have equal opportunity to use or enjoy a dwelling. So we've seen a lot of problems with reasonable accommodation in the emergency housing program at legal aid. At a fair hearing in one of my cases last year, the department witness testified that the accommodation my client had requested was reasonable and necessary for her disability, but it wasn't on the right piece of paper, and that was why they had denied it. That's absolutely not legal. You can offer a form to help people ask for reasonable accommodations, but you cannot require a person to use a specific form to ask for a reasonable accommodation. That's really basic. A colleague of mine also recently had a fair hearing this past fall where the department took the position that any change to a rule would be unreasonable. That's, we can't bend any rules. That's the fundamental requirement of reasonable accommodation, is that you can bend rules as necessary to grant somebody equal access to the program. So, I'm not sure what to ask for in the bill, already required by multiple federal and state laws, but I do think it would be helpful to require legally compliant reasonable accommodation processes, the department again in this bill. Another sort of picky thing is that I would ask for appeals, for a requirement that appeals be expedited. Appeals have been traditionally expedited by the department in emergency housing cases. Oh, I did want to say, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. I really appreciate the part in H91 that requires notices to use plain language and to provide written notice in the household's preferred form of communication. That's really wise and really helpful and very necessary. I do want to talk about the biggest issue we've been seeing in expediting appeals has been getting access to the record. I actually had a colleague who had a hearing yesterday. She asked for a hearing for somebody who was unsheltered, who was eligible for emergency housing. It took a week to get the hearing, but it took 6 days to get the record. She got the record the afternoon before the hearing. And that's also when the Attorney General's office gets the record, which is frustrating because often if the AG handling the case and legal aid gets the record, we can both look at it and know what happened and get ready for the hearing. But often we just talk to each other. Okay, yeah, I give up, or yeah, you're right, or, or this is what we do. But without seeing the records, we can't have those conversations. It's like, I know what my client told me, I know what your client's telling you, but we don't actually know what really happened. So we would ask that there be a same day or next day supervisor review on appeal, which used to be the process, but it's dropped out. So that I'm appealing a denial of emergency housing, a supervisor's going to look at it the next day. They're going to look at the record that next day or the same day and decide whether they're upholding the denial or not. If they uphold the denial, they're going to send the record immediately to the appellant and to the department's attorney, the Attorney General's office.
So what happens now when somebody asks for an appeal in terms of sort of levels? In most places, like in AHS, there's an internal review, which is kind of like what you're talking about, that sort of supervisory review, and then elevated to the commissioner's office and then Human Services Board. That's sort of what my experience has been. And are you saying that that's not what happens in this program?
Not as far as I can tell. Sometimes I see a review later in the notes, but no, not typically. Are you seeing that, Brenda? No.
Yeah,
yeah.
please don't ask.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's right. It's like witnesses talk to the committee. That's okay.
I'm so sorry. Sharon.
That's okay. That's all right.
No, I'm not seeing that happening now,
Okay.
not regularly. And we're required, because we're attorneys, we have to talk to the Attorney General's office.
Mhm.
And those attorneys are lovely, but they are often saying this, I don't know anything. I don't have the record yet. I don't have the record yet.
Mhm.
So we can't resolve anything. And I don't see those reviews happening. I haven't seen the reviews happening, no.
Okay, thank you.
So same day or next day supervisor review. It used to be the district director, which I don't think is a title anymore, but some kind of supervisor, immediate record transmission, a preliminary decision within 5 days, and immediate implementation of favorable decisions. The immediate implementation of favorable decisions has been department practice for a long time and still is, but we do want that to continue.
One of the things that I am thinking about is that, you know, we have there's only a certain capacity. Sorry, thought I got it all. There it is. Sorry. There's only a certain capacity, so let's just like right now we're at our maximum capacity. So somebody could be successful in their appeal and there still not be a place for them. So I'm not sure. I guess what I'm saying is it couldn't be an absolute, you know, immediate implementation of the appeal if there's insufficient capacity. I'm sort of like thinking in my head how could or would that work if we're at maximum capacity.
Well, what's happened for us is that the department will just say, yes, we agree this person's eligible. Now the next step is to figure out, is there a room available for them? And they go into the same pool with everybody else who's eligible and trying to figure out if
Okay,
there's.
so it's agreeing that they're eligible and then moving to that next stage. Okay,
Exactly.
not automatically saying you now have a room.
No.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
So the last thing I wanted to talk a little bit is about data gathering, and I have appreciated how much this committee has been focused on looking at the system as a whole. Actually, I have this other graph that I love about the system as a whole and the data that is necessary for policymakers to really know how to end homelessness by looking at all parts of the system as one whole working part. So we would ask that the data requirements in H91 be expanded. One piece of data that is particularly important to us is why and how people are becoming homeless. So that was the chart I flipped through, but this one, these are numbers I pulled out of the recent housing reports that DCF has submitted to the legislature.
Mhm.
So it's showing that about 500 people a month are entering coordinated entry, which is really high.
Which isn't even everybody.
Which isn't even everybody.
Waiting list to get into coordinated entry.
Right. But the number that really sticks out to me that I would like more data on or more study about is 25% of the people entering coordinated entry are returnees who were previously placed in permanent housing. So like that didn't work. And I have been listening to testimony and there's a lot of programs that really do work well, but I think we need data about these are the combinations of housing subsidy and services that are really working. And these are the ones that aren't working so well, and prioritize funding for the ones that are working. But we don't have that data. We can see the data of returns, but I have asked for the data about like, well, so where are people returning from? Like what kind of placements were these? I strongly suspect that it's places where people didn't have an adequate subsidy and didn't have adequate services. That if you were in family supportive housing or then you probably are doing okay. And if you're not, those are the people who got placed and were just left twisting in the wind and bombed out really quickly. But that's not a good use of public resources. Anyway, I don't actually know that. I don't have the data, but that's one of the things that I worry about. And I would like more data about, okay, well, who's entering homelessness and why? And for the homelessness prevention programs or people exiting homelessness, which ones are actually really working? So it's this little bathtub graphic, the red thing it's on the left, damaging cycle. So exiting people from homelessness to a placement that is not going to work for them. And then they end up with another eviction on their record, the trauma of rehomelessness, they're back in, we wasted all those public funds and all their time. Let's stop that cycle and get people into housing that's going to be stable for the long term. I did also want to ask, one other thing. So this committee has been very focused, rightly, and the bill is focused on people who are in emergency housing, but I would also ask that the advisory committee created by the bill consider people who are excluded from emergency housing. So people who are homeless but are excluded from emergency housing either because they're not eligible or they can't get through those bureaucratic barriers we talked about, or because they're on a do not rent list or they have a service animal. Who's excluded from emergency housing while they're homeless? What's happening to them? What should be public policy for them? And I think importantly, what is the cost to the public that exclusion creates? So we know the cost of the emergency housing program, but the cost of not placing people in emergency housing is also very real. So just keeping those in balance, I think, is important for the advisory committee to also look at. So I really appreciate you considering my comments. I don't know if you have any other questions or.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Representative McGill. And I just want to touch base. Angie, are you able to stick around for a little while? Okay, because I don't think that our joint assembly will take too long. So I don't want to like smoosh you in 5 minutes. If that's okay, can we come back to you after joint assembly?
Perfect.
Okay, all right, thank you. Representative McGill.
Yeah, my question is just about this, your last point about the advisory committee.
Yeah.
Which I wholly support. My question is, how, do you have any ideas on how we can support folks who are currently unsheltered and being able to participate in the advisory committee? I run the Youth Action Board for our own programs, and I know it can be really hard, even when you are like newly housed or in kind of a stable situation to participate. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas on how to make it actually plausible for folks to be able to participate in an advisory committee like this. In addition to all of the other barriers that you're saying. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the question. It's such an insightful question. And yes, I do. There are a number of peer drop-in centers around the state of all different kinds. So in St. Johnsbury, it's the St. Johnsbury Hub. So I know when the planning was happening for the Medicaid supportive housing, they were looking for people who are unhoused to talk. And I said, I know a group of people. And that the hub was able to put together sort of a focus group and people came in. And then you're not having to travel. You're with people that you already know in a safe space. So if there's a way for the advisory group to go, Pathways has a drop-in center in Burlington. There's another way in, I don't know if that's Berlin or Barry, but they're all over the Montpelier. Thank you. They're all over the state. These places where people who are homeless can come in, and some places have a shower, have a computer, have staff. They'll see people they know. They often have food. So for the advisory committee to be able to go around there and meet people where they're at, and where they already feel safe and have peer support.
Okay, any other quick questions? Thank you so much for being here and for your, it's really helpful when people have specific recommendations and reactions. So that's very, very helpful. So thank you very much. And no reason to be intimidated. You were great. Very helpful. Okay, folks, we need to